What is the most optimal training intensity distribution? To be completely honest, I reckon this is probably a pretty loaded question because I don't actually reckon there is one. That's the short answer. But that's what we're going to dive into today. So grab yourself a coffee. In this video, we're going to be talking about training intensity distribution and why there actually probably isn't an optimal training intensity distribution, and why at the same time they're all pretty optimal depending on where you're at in your preparation and what you're trying to achieve. So grab that coffee. It's time to get into another Coffee Thoughts. Let's get into it. All right, welcome back to another Coffee Thoughts. In this one, we're discussing training intensity distribution. Now, I've covered this on the channel before when it comes to what this actually means, so go check that video out if you haven't already. Very quick overview. Training intensity distribution is just a way of defining and understanding how much training are we doing in various parts of our physiology. It's commonly broken down in a research perspective into 3 categories: zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, trying to look at how much time is spent with each of those parameters. Often it's defined as your long slow all the way up to just borderline tempo, which is sort of LT1, lactate threshold 1. Everything in the middle section, zone 2, is right through to sort of your traditional threshold, FTP, whatever you like to call it. And then everything above that incorporates things like VO2 max, your anaerobic, is a zone 3. Now, it keeps it simple, but ultimately in the research, one of the initial flaws with understanding, well, is one more optimal than another, is the semantics and definitions. Sometimes these get mischaracterized, or because of the definition you use. If you say lactate threshold, what does a lactate threshold mean? Does that mean, is it 2 millimole? Is it 2.5? Are we talking about, we're looking at a change of millimole to define that because we're going more individualized? Are we talking about as a percentage of VO2 max? All of these things already floor the system in terms of comparing training intensity distributions, because all the research is slightly different in different areas depending on how you define things. When we look at it and go, well, which model is the most optimal? That's a question that I think is really eye-catching for people to read on a blog post or a video or in a research article, because it sort of alludes to the fact that there is a more optimal method, rather than trying to break it down and understand that maybe they're all just as optimal as each other. And the really important question we actually need to be asking is, when should we use each of these different intensity distributions to drive the actual result we're looking for? Now, if I take a 70.3 triathlon, I work with a lot of 70.3 athletes. I personally really like that distance. I think it's a really interesting distance to train and work out the ins and outs of. Let's use that as an example. Now, if I've got someone at the start of their preparation, we might be doing, say, a 6 or a 7 month preparation leading into a 70.3. For example, there's a lot of contextual things that need to go on here, but pure example, we might be leading into that for, say, 6 months. The initial part of that preparation, my focus from a coaching and training sense is I want to get them as fit as they possibly can aerobically, give them the biggest possible engine they can, biggest VO2 max, highest amount of power they can put out at the top end, like really well developed zone 2 aerobic capacity, ability to go like long and slow, low blood lactate. I want to develop as much of an aerobic profile as I can to get them as fit as they can, so that one, they can handle the training coming up in the specific block, but also it allows them to work harder in those specific blocks. And bigger engine, we can do more with it, we can output more aerobically. It allows us to push harder in those more specific training sessions. That's my goal. That's my overarching theme when I think of the beginning of a preparation for something like a 70.3. You can flow that into Ironman, marathon, half marathon, whatever your endurance event is. I'm early on in the prep, get as fit as you can just from a general sense. We don't need to worry about very specifics yet. Just get as fit as we can to give us the ability to do effectively whatever we want to do or output more later on. When I think about training intensity distribution to drive that, it's probably going to be more of a polarized approach. You're 80-20, lots of long, slow endurance, and some of that really upper end stimulus to really drive that top end of VO2 max. That's going to give us as much of the aerobic adaptation as possible, get us as aerobically fit in a broad sense as we can. It's not very specific though to a 70.3. Some events it will be more or less specific depending on what we're talking about. But for a 70.3 in this example, it's not the most specific. The long slow stuff is just below race intensity and well below race intensity. The high intensity stuff is way above. We're talking up and near VO2 max. So from that perspective, our race intensity sits in between. Like, how is that going to be beneficial? Well, we're not doing this the entire time. If you went through and did a polarized approach the entire way through, you might be able to get away with it. Potentially if you're quite a beginner athlete, and it is just about getting generally fitter and fitter and fitter. So we need to find the specificity. So once we've built out that and we've used our polarized approach, that's where it is more so about transitioning to something like a pyramidal approach. Still a lot of long slow, and that's still the dominant, building a lot of the aerobic adaptations at the bottom end. We still keep a percentage of the very, very upper end, but then we start introducing more of that middle, that sort of threshold tempo type work, because it's very race specific. That's going to develop the specificity aspect. That's what I want in that last 6, 8, 10 weeks of preparation, is get honed into the exact intensities I want to be holding out on course, or I want the athlete to be holding out on course. Try to minimize as much rest within that as we can. Long, sustained efforts, getting very, very specific to what we're actually going to output. So there's no surprises ultimately. And that's a very logical way to think about it, but physiologically, we're getting all the specific adaptations we need for that event by doing the specific work. It makes sense. So that's where in a preparation like that, I go, we've used 2 different training intensity distributions. One is more superior than the other in certain phases, but they're all optimal as part of the preparation. I might also throw in some threshold based, a bit more threshold sort of structure in there as well. If I'm really trying to drive some of that middle portion and we want to back the volume off for a bit. If race focus changes and we go a bit more Olympic distance, maybe I'll do that as well. It's about understanding what these actually mean and then implementing them into your preparation. So that's just kind of the thoughts I wanted to go through, because I've been thinking about this over the last week or so, listening to a couple of podcasts touching on this as a topic, and I've had some interesting discussions in my Instagram DMs with a couple of athletes discussing this as well, where it's kind of like we have this want and desire to be like, what is the most optimal? I'm only going to use that. When in actual fact, we need to understand how they all piece together to build a preparation over time. And the way I've just described it by no means is the only way you can go about it. There are other approaches to be able to achieve a very similar result. That's just the way I find makes the most sense logically, in terms of trying to develop as much aerobically as we can first. Then we start broad and we just narrow our focus in. It's kind of like what we're doing as we get closer and closer to racing, which is going to give us ultimately our best result. Always interested to hear what your perspectives are on training intensity distribution in this topic. Leave them in the comments down below. Happy to hear what you think. Which approaches do you use? Are you more of a traditional threshold type distribution commonly? Have you played around with polarized or a pyramidal approach? There's a number of different distributions. Main takeaway I want you to have from this is use them strategically. One is not necessarily better than the other overall. Research is not conclusive to tell us that this method or this distribution is going to be far superior than all other distributions across all parts of the preparation. It's about looking at the context at the time and what are we actually trying to achieve. The different distributions are going to lead to slightly different outcomes and manipulate our physiology to do slightly different things. And if we can strategically link them together in a preparation, a whole preparation for an event, 6, 7, 8 months, particularly for our long course type events, that's where you're going to get your best result. So again, leave your thoughts down below in the comments. Any other topics you'd like me to discuss on the channel here, also leave them down below and let me know. Enjoying doing some of these coffee thoughts. Hopefully you get a bit out of me just ranting and giving some ideas about sports science, science of endurance, and everything else in between. But I'm going to finish this coffee. Hopefully you enjoy your coffee as well. And we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.
And I just wanna ball, somebody I can call. Trophies on the wall, can I really have it all? Just wanna ball, somebody I can call. Trophies on the wall, can I really have it all?